It's 1862, and the jungle outside Huiyapan, in the Mexican state of Veracruz, is thick and wet and largely unmapped by outsiders. A Mexican archaeologist named José Melgar is clearing brush along a low rise of earth when his crew's tools strike something that shouldn't be there: stone, and a lot of it. Days of digging later, a face emerges from the mud, nose down, buried for who knows how long. It is basalt. It is taller than a man, and it is unlike anything documented in the region before. Melgar has just uncovered the first Olmec colossal head anyone has ever recorded. He studies the face in front of him, and shortly afterward, he writes 2 papers about what he believes he's found. In them, he attributes the sculpted features to what he calls a Negro race. No excavation has been properly run yet. No context has been established. It is one man, one photograph, and one conclusion. And it becomes the very first written record of the theory this entire video is about. That single guess, made before a single Olmec site had been professionally excavated, does not die with Melgar. It travels. It picks up believers across the next century. And by the 1970s, it has a name, a publisher, and a best-selling book behind it. Ivan van Sertima's They Came Before Columbus. It survives television specials. It survives the internet. Today, the same claim Melgar scribbled down in 1862 still circulates as settled fact, repeated in comment sections, and stitched into TikTok slideshows as though it were established science. But the actual answer to what Melgar saw that day hasn't been sitting in a 19th century notebook for the last century and a half. It's been sitting in a lab since 2012, encoded into 364,470 individual points of genetic data, pulled from 52 populations spread across 2 continents. This video is going to look at what that data actually says, not what a guess made by one man, staring at one face, in one jungle, over 160 years ago, decided it meant. If you want the receipts before the conclusion, that's exactly what's coming, so go ahead and subscribe now so you don't lose the channel halfway through. Melgar wasn't the last person to look at a stone face and see exactly what he expected to see. The theory most people have actually heard goes something like this. Africans reached Mesoamerica centuries before Columbus ever set sail, and they directly shaped the civilization the Olmecs built on the Gulf Coast. It's usually delivered as a package of 3 claims stacked together. The colossal head's facial features as visual proof, no laboratory work required. The pyramids, and mummification, all pointing back to Egypt and Nubia specifically. It's a claim with real cultural weight behind it. It has been taught in some community programs, and it's been referenced across decades of African American studies literature, treated by many as an established counter-history to the standard textbook version of the Americas. But there's a group of people conspicuously absent from that history, the professional Mesoamericanist archaeologists who have spent entire careers excavating San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. For decades, that community largely didn't engage with the theory at all, not because they'd tested it and found it wanting, but because it simply hadn't been raised inside their field in a form that demanded a formal response. And there's a basic geography problem sitting underneath the whole claim before any lab work even enters the picture. The Nile Delta and the Veracruz coast sit roughly 2,600 miles apart, separated by open ocean, with no wind pattern or current route that lines up with what's known about sailing technology available around 700 BCE. That's not a detail van Sertima's version of events accounts for. The real story here isn't Egypt versus Mexico. It's the gap between a claim that gets repeated constantly and a claim that actually gets tested. And that gap is the entire subject of this video. The man who built the modern version of this case did so with a specific set of named claims, dates, and peoples attached to it, and those specifics are exactly what let historians and archaeologists eventually put the theory under a microscope. Ivan van Sertima was not an archaeologist. He wasn't a geneticist, and he wasn't a Mesoamericanist. He was a professor of literature and African studies at Rutgers University, and in 1976, he published a book called They Came Before Columbus through Random House, a mainstream trade press, with no peer review process behind it. The book itself isn't written as a strictly academic argument. Large portions of it are structured as narrative fiction, with entire chapters narrated by historical figures, including Christopher Columbus himself and the Mali king Abu Bakr II speaking in the first person. Van Sertima didn't stop at the book. He went on to found the Journal of African Civilizations, giving the theory a continuing academic adjacent platform to keep circulating in. And the theory itself wasn't vague. Van Sertima's central claim was specific. Nubian and Egyptian visitors, connected to Africa's 25th dynasty, made contact with the Olmecs around 700 BCE. He described a second, entirely separate wave of contact arriving later, from the Mali Empire, around 1300 CE. And he didn't just say Africa in some general sense. He specifically identified the Olmecs with the Mande people of West Africa, a named ethnic group tied to a named historical era. That specificity is actually what makes the whole claim useful in a strange way. A vague claim about ancient contact is nearly impossible to disprove. A named people, a named dynasty, and two named centuries give historians something concrete to check against the archaeological and genetic record. Van Sertima had built something testable, whether he intended it that way or not. A claim built with this much specific detail, names, dynasties, decades, invites a direct test, and Mesoamericanist archaeology eventually ran exactly that test, though it took over 2 decades to happen. In 1997, the journal Current Anthropology published a paper by Ortiz de Montellano, Barbour and Fox, titled Robbing Native American Cultures, Van Sertima's Afrocentricity and the Olmecs. It was the first full academic evaluation the theory had ever received. The standard the authors applied was straightforward. If two ancient civilizations made real contact, the strongest possible proof is a genuine foreign artifact recovered from a controlled archaeological excavation. So they checked. Applied directly to Van Sertima's Egypt Olmec claim, the result was blunt. 0 genuine African artifacts have ever been recovered from a controlled excavation anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. Not one Egyptian scarab, not one Nubian ceramic vessel, not one inscribed object of African origin, despite well over a century of professional excavation across the entire Mesoamerican region. The paper also addressed the 2 other pillars of the popular version of the theory directly. The claims that pyramid building and mummification practices were diffused into Mesoamerica from Egypt. Both were rejected. Mesoamerican pyramid construction and mummification practices each show independent, traceable developmental sequences within the region itself, with no gap in the archaeological record that would require an outside origin to explain. The paper's overall conclusion doesn't hedge. It states plainly that the proposal is devoid of any foundation. There were, however, 2 pieces of biological evidence connecting the Old World and the New World that the authors did have to reckon with directly. 2 data points that, on the surface, look like exactly the kind of contact evidence the theory needs. Those 2 pieces are worth examining closely, because once you look past the surface, they turn out to be the closest thing this entire theory has to physical evidence, and they cut in the opposite direction from where the theory needs them to point. 2 biological facts sit at the center of the only physical evidence Van Sertima's theory has ever produced. The first is the bottle gourd, Lagenaria cixareria, a plant that is genetically African in origin, yet shows up clearly in the pre-Columbian archaeological record of the Americas. The second is New World cotton, Gossypium hirsutum, which likewise carries African origin genetic material inside its genome. Both of these facts are real. Neither one is disputed by mainstream researchers. Old World biology and New World biology did make contact with each other at some point in the deep past. The problem is timing. Both of these genetic transfers occurred across a span of tens of thousands of years, consistent with slow, natural ocean drift, seeds and plant material carried by currents over an immense stretch of time, long before human beings had developed any capability for open ocean seafaring at all. Neither the gourd nor the cotton carries any documented connection to Egypt, to Nubia, or to a specific contact event happening around 700 BCE. Citing them as proof of an Egyptian Olmec meeting quietly swaps one timescale for another, treating slow biological drift spanning tens of thousands of years as though it were evidence for a single claimed voyage that supposedly happened in one particular century. It's the only physical, Old World contact evidence the entire case has ever produced, and it turns out to predate the existence of human sailing altogether. With the artifact case sitting completely empty and the biological evidence pointing to a timeline that has nothing to do with Egypt or Nubia, the theory has nowhere left to stand except on appearance, on the faces themselves, carved directly into 17 tons of basalt. So that's exactly where the next part of this story has to go, to the stone, and to the 17 heads carved out of it. 17 colossal heads have been found to date, and the count breaks down site by site. 10 at San Lorenzo, 4 at La Venta, 2 at Tres Zapotes, and 1 at Rancho La Cobata. They are not uniform in size. Heights across the 17 range from 1.47 meters up to 3.4 meters, and weights run anywhere from 6 tons to more than 25 tons of solid stone. Every one of them was carved from a single basalt boulder, quarried at Cerro Sintepec in the Tuxtla Mountains, and some of those boulders were moved more than 100 kilometers before a single chisel mark was made. Hauled by river raft where the water allowed it, and by log roller across dry land where it didn't. San Lorenzo dominated the region first, from roughly 1800 BCE down to around 850 BCE, with its peak building phase concentrated between 1150 and 900 BCE. Then La Venta rose to power, holding dominance from roughly 850 down to 350 BCE, and Tres Zapotes emerged after that, as La Venta's influence declined. At least 2 of the 17 heads show clear evidence of having been recarved from earlier stone altar thrones, monuments that scholars connect to specific ruling lineages, not to some broad marker of an entire population's ethnic identity. And that detail matters, because the wrinkles, the proportions, the individual variation carved into each face are read by specialists as portraiture, as records of specific named rulers, in the same artistic tradition as classic Maya ruler portraits, or the individualized royal portraiture of the Peruvian Moche centuries later and a continent away. 17 heads, 4 sites, roughly 1,000 years of construction, and every indication that what's carved into that basalt are the faces of particular men who held power in particular moments, not a stand-in for an entire foreign population. That distinction, portrait versus ethnic marker, turns out to be the whole argument. If these are portraits of specific individuals, carved by artists working from life or from memory of a real ruler's face, then the question worth asking isn't which distant continent they represent. It's simpler than that, and far more direct. Whose faces are actually carved into that stone? Start with what's documented about Nubians specifically. Coming from a desert environment, Nubians are recorded as having long, high-bridged noses, a distinct and well-documented facial structure tied to that specific population. Now look at the 17 Olmec heads themselves. Overwhelmingly, what's carved into that basalt are broad, flat noses and thick lips, a direct mismatch with the exact Nubian features Van Sertima's theory requires in order to hold up. And the visual argument gets shakier the closer you look at its own history. Some early 20th century observers, including Leo Wiener, looked at these same faces and read them as Asian rather than African, which on its own exposes just how subjective a purely visual interpretation really is. 2 trained observers, looking at identical stone, reaching opposite ethnic conclusions. That's not a coincidence of bad luck. It reflects something more fundamental about human facial variation. Across modern human populations, craniofacial features vary continuously and overlap heavily from one population to the next. Treating a broad nose and thick lips as a unique, exclusive African signature isn't just a shaky reading of Olmec sculpture, it's a factual error in physical anthropology more broadly. That exact combination of features shows up across indigenous American populations, entirely independent of any claimed African contact. And Mesoamericanist scholars, looking at all 17 heads side by side, have repeatedly pointed to the facial variety between them as evidence of individual portraiture, different faces for different rulers, rather than the same ethnic type being repeated over and over across 4 different sites and 1,000 years of construction. The visual argument was always the weakest form of evidence this theory ever produced, resting entirely on subjective interpretation of stone rather than anything that can be independently tested. That's exactly why the 1997 academic evaluation didn't lean on facial interpretation at all. It built its case on artifacts and on language. And language turns out to close this case just as hard as the artifact record already did. The Olmec language belongs to the Mixtezoque family, a language family that is still spoken today in parts of Oaxaca, Veracruz, and Chiapas. Mixtezoque shows no structural relationship, no shared vocabulary, and no grammatical connection to any African language family. Not Nilo-Saharan, not Afroasiatic, not Niger-Congo, nor any other branch of the African linguistic tree. Linguists who have worked on reconstructing Proto-Mixtezoque find its vocabulary rooted directly in local Mesoamerican flora, fauna, and cultural terms specific to that region, with loanwords flowing back and forth between Mixtezoque and its neighboring Mesoamerican languages, not across any ocean. Built on top of this language sits a writing system considered the earliest known full script anywhere in the ancient Americas. If a contact event significant enough to reshape a civilization's religion and system of rulership had actually occurred, a Nubian or Malian presence substantial enough to leave the kind of mark Van Sertima's theory describes, linguists would expect to find some trace of it. A loanword, an influence on the script structure, any linguistic footprint at all. No such footprint has ever been documented in Mesoamerica by any linguist who has worked on the language. The absence isn't a gap in the research, it's the research. And there's a broader point sitting inside this finding that's easy to miss. Independent invention of a full writing system is genuinely rare across world history. Only a handful of civilizations ever developed one without borrowing the concept from somewhere else. That rarity makes the Olmecs' achievement, standing entirely on its own, a far bigger point in their favor than any diffusion story could ever be. It means what they built themselves, without an outside hand guiding the process. Artifacts came back empty. Faces turned out to be portraiture, not ethnic record, and now language closes the same door a third time. The strongest evidence in this entire case hasn't even entered the conversation yet. Step back from any single piece of evidence and look at the civilization as a whole. Mesoamericanist scholarship treats the Olmec calendar system, the precursor to the later long count calendar, and the monumental architecture built at San Lorenzo and La Venta as independently developed technologies, homegrown, not imported. The Olmec are frequently described as Mesoamerica's mother culture, and that title exists precisely because later civilizations, the Maya, the Zapotec, and eventually the Aztec, inherited elements from the Olmecs. The direction of influence runs forward through Mesoamerican history, not backward across an ocean. San Lorenzo's rise, dated to around 1800 BCE, predates any plausible transatlantic contact scenario by more than 1,000 years. The civilization was already established long before the timeline Van Sertima's theory requires. And the economic picture backs this up in detail. Trade networks moving jade, obsidian, and iron ore mirrors across hundreds of kilometers of Mesoamerican territory are documented archaeologically in fine detail. A functioning, long-distance economy that explains how goods, ideas, and influence spread across the region without needing any outside contact to account for it. The rubber ball game, the calendar system, the jaguar-centered religious iconography that recurs across Olmec art. Every one of these traces backward into earlier Mesoamerican Archaic period antecedents. Not into North Africa, not into Egypt or Nubia. None of it required outside contact to exist. The pieces were already there, developing on their own timeline, inside the region itself. What's left to explain isn't a pot, a carved symbol, or a grammatical structure anymore. It's something written directly into the population's DNA. A biological record that doesn't rely on interpretation the way a carved face or a trade route does. And that record doesn't begin with the Olmecs at all. It begins 25,000 years before a single Olmec city ever existed. Tamm and colleagues, publishing in 2007 in the journal PLoS 1, established what's known as the Beringian standstill hypothesis. Their finding, the ancestors of every Native American population split away from Northern Eurasian and East Asian lineages roughly 25,000 years ago. That founding population didn't move directly into the Americas after that split. The genetic evidence shows they remained isolated in Beringia, the land bridge now submerged beneath the Bering Strait, for roughly 6,000 years before colonization of the Americas even began. That colonization proper only started around 16,000 years ago, once shifting ice sheet conditions finally opened a viable route south. Sit with that 6,000-year figure for a moment. It's longer than the entire span of recorded human writing, and the ancestors of every indigenous population that would eventually spread across North, Central, and South America spent that entire stretch of time isolated together in one place, before a single one of them had set foot anywhere near what would become Mexico. Every population descended from that standstill group carries its genetic signature today, Olmec descendants included. This isn't a regional finding limited to Mexico or to Mesoamerica. It's a signature that shows up across the entire Western Hemisphere, confirmed independently across dozens of separate population studies conducted by different research teams using different methods. 25,000 years of shared ancestry, 6,000 years of isolation in one specific place, and 16,000 years since colonization began, all of it tracing back to Northern Eurasia and East Asia. There is no open window anywhere in that timeline for a separate African founding population to have arrived first, or to have arrived at all. That signature isn't abstract. It shows up in a specific, testable piece of DNA, the kind that only ever passes down through mothers. Every indigenous population across the Americas carries one of 5 founding mitochondrial haplogroups, A2, B2, C1, D1, and D4H3A. All 5 trace directly back to Northern Asian source populations. Not one of them has any African origin. In 2009, Perego and colleagues, publishing in Current Biology, identified 2 additional rare mtDNA haplogroups that mark separate Paleo-Indian migration routes leaving Beringia, a refinement of the map, adding detail to how different groups moved, without changing which continent any of them came from. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down from mother to child almost unchanged across thousands of years, which is exactly what makes it one of the most reliable tools available for tracing deep ancestry. It doesn't get scrambled the way other genetic material does with each generation, so a signature present today points back, largely intact, to a population that existed tens of thousands of years ago. These 5 haplogroups don't show up in isolated pockets or a single region. They appear in genetic samples recovered from Alaska all the way down to the southern tip of Chile, a pattern unbroken across the entire hemisphere. 2 continents, thousands of kilometers, and one consistent genetic thread running through all of it. No African mitochondrial haplogroup appears as a founding lineage anywhere in the pre-contact indigenous American genetic record. Not in the North, not in Mesoamerica, not in South America. The maternal line is only half of the picture, though. It traces ancestry through mothers, generation after generation, but it says nothing on its own about the paternal side of the family tree. For that, there's a separate marker entirely, one that runs through fathers and sons instead of mothers and daughters. And that marker, when researchers checked it independently, came back with the identical story written into it. 2 Y chromosome haplogroups, haplogroup C and haplogroup Q, represent the founding paternal lineages of the entire Americas. Both are confirmed to be of Asian origin, tracing back through Siberian populations and the broader northern Eurasian genetic pool. Because Y chromosome DNA passes from father to son largely unchanged across generations, it functions as a completely independent cross-check against the mitochondrial record, a separate inheritance system, tracing a separate line of descent, with no reason it had to agree with the maternal findings at all. And yet it does, completely. There's a complication researchers have to work around, though. Post-Columbian history muddies modern paternal line sampling significantly, because European and African male-mediated admixture increased sharply after 1492, driven in part by uneven population decline patterns across different communities during the colonial era. That means simply sampling paternal DNA from people alive today risks picking up 5 centuries of colonial mixing, layered on top of the deep ancestral signal. Researchers have to correct for that admixture specifically in order to isolate what the founding population actually looked like genetically. Once that correction is applied, haplogroups C and Q remain standing as the only founding paternal lines ever identified. 2 entirely separate inheritance systems, one tracing through mothers and one through fathers, both independently pointing to the same single continent of origin. Not 2 continents, not a split origin story. Asia, confirmed twice, through 2 different biological mechanisms that had no reason to agree unless the underlying history was real. The scale of confirmation didn't stop at 2 markers, though. The largest genetic study ever assembled to answer this exact question took both the maternal and paternal lines and ran them through a single unified analysis in 2012. 52 populations, 364,470 data points. One paper changed how confidently anyone could answer this question ever again. David Reich and his colleagues published Reconstructing Native American Population History in the journal Nature, volume 488 in 2012. The scale of the study was enormous. The team genotyped 52 Native American populations and 17 Siberian populations, screening each one at 364,470 single nucleotide polymorphisms, individual points across the genome where genetic variation can be measured and compared. To build a dataset that large, the researchers merged 273 newly collected Native American samples with data pulled from 6 prior independent studies, assembling the most comprehensive picture of Native American genetic ancestry that had existed up to that point. The central finding reshaped the entire conversation. Native Americans descend from at least 3 separate streams of Asian gene flow, not a single uniform wave, and certainly not an African one. The overwhelming majority of the populations sampled, Mesoamerican populations included, descend entirely from a single ancestral group, the authors labeled First American. 2 smaller populations broke from that pattern, but stayed within the same continental story. Eskimo Aleut speakers in the Arctic carry nearly half their ancestry from a second, distinct Asian migration stream, separate from the First American population. The Na-Dene-speaking Chippewayan of Canada carry roughly a tenth of their ancestry from yet a third stream, again, still Asian, just a different wave arriving at a different time. Even the two populations that don't fit neatly into the single first American model still trace their ancestry back to Asia. There's no scenario anywhere in this data, primary or secondary, major population or minor one, that opens a door to Africa. 3 streams, all Asian, all documented across the largest data set of its kind ever assembled. But there was one number buried in that same study that, left unaddressed, could have complicated the entire result until the research team controlled for it directly. The 2012 dataset carried an average of 8.5% non-native admixture across the modern populations sampled, a mix of European and African ancestry that had accumulated in the 5 centuries since 1492. Left uncorrected, that admixture risked blurring a genuine, tens of thousands of years old ancestral signal, together with a much more recent layer of colonial-era mixing, making the two nearly impossible to tell apart in a casual reading of the data. So the Reich team isolated a clean subset specifically to rule that risk out. 163 individuals, drawn from 34 populations, each one showing no detectable European or African admixture at all. Running the same 3-stream Asian origin model against that fully unadmixed subset produced the identical result as the full dataset. The signal held, completely, with the colonial-era noise removed entirely from the equation. This distinction matters directly for the question at the center of this whole video. Modern Mexican populations that carry some African ancestry today reflect documented colonial-era history, not a contact event from 700 BCE. And geneticists now have the precise tools needed to tell those two very different timelines apart. The unadmixed control is exactly what separates two very different statements. Some Mexicans today have African ancestry, which is true, and has nothing to do with the Olmecs. And the Olmecs had African ancestry 2,700 years ago, which is unsupported by every single dataset tested so far. With the continental scale pattern locked down this firmly, one question still remained open. Did Mesoamerica specifically, the exact region the Olmecs called home, tell that same story when researchers looked at it directly, rather than as part of a hemisphere-wide average? It does, and the clearest version of that answer comes from bones recovered only a few hundred kilometers from the Olmec heartland itself. In 2009, Sandoval and colleagues published a study in the journal Human Genetics built directly from pre-Hispanic Maya skeletal remains, sequencing mitochondrial DNA pulled straight from ancient bone rather than from modern living populations. The sample sites span the Mexican states of Yucatan, Chiapas, Quintana Roo, and Tabasco in particular sits directly adjacent to the Olmec heartland along the Gulf Coast, making this the closest geographic proximity any ancient DNA study has come to Olmec territory itself. The researchers compared these ancient individuals against contemporary Mesoamerican Maya populations, and against a wider set of reference populations drawn from Asia, from Beringia, and from North, Central, and South America together. The founding lineages recovered from these ancient Maya remains match the same Asian-derived haplogroups found across the rest of the continent. No African mitochondrial signal turned up in a single sample. This is, geographically and culturally, the nearest that direct ancient DNA testing has ever come to the Olmec zone specifically. The Olmec civilization itself thrived for roughly 3,000 years within this same broader Gulf Coast cultural sphere, sharing trade networks and cultural influence with the very populations these Maya remains are drawn from. That proximity gives the finding real weight for the Olmec question, even without a sample pulled from Olmec bone directly. There's one honest gap left in this entire picture though, and it deserves to be named plainly rather than glossed over or waved away. No laboratory has ever successfully tested ancient DNA recovered from an Olmec skeleton itself. That absence is real, and it's worth sitting with honestly, rather than treating it as a small footnote to skip past on the way to a tidy conclusion. Let's be honest about where the physical evidence actually runs out. Tropical heat and humidity across Veracruz and Tabasco degrade DNA far faster than the cooler, drier conditions found at the highland and Yucatan sites where most Mesoamerican ancient DNA work has actually succeeded. Because of that difference in preservation, Mesoamerican aDNA research has leaned heavily on mitochondrial DNA rather than full genomes, and it has clustered geographically around the basin of Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula, rather than the Gulf Coast lowlands where the Olmecs actually lived. No skeletal remains confidently identified as Olmec-era Gulf Coast individuals have yielded usable ancient DNA to date. Not one. That means the Olmec-specific genetic case has to be built on surrounding evidence rather than a direct sample. hemisphere-wide founder lineages, regional Maya samples recovered one state over, and total archaeological and linguistic silence on any African contact whatsoever, rather than a DNA sample pulled straight out of a grave at San Lorenzo itself. But surrounding evidence is still evidence. Every single population tested within the broader Mesoamerican and Native American genetic pool, without exception, traces back to the same 3 Asian migration streams already laid out. A missing direct sample from one specific site doesn't open up space for a claim that every adjacent dataset, every language study, and every controlled excavation conducted across more than a century has already ruled out. The absence of Olmec-specific DNA is a genuine research gap, worth naming honestly rather than glossing over. It is not, however, a reason to prefer a theory with 0 supporting artifacts over one backed by a documented 25,000-year genetic paper trail spanning 2 continents. There's a second irony buried in this whole story, and unlike everything examined so far, it involves DNA that genuinely is African. Mexico's Costa Chica region, stretched along the Oaxaca and Guerrero coastline, is home to a well-documented Afro-Mexican population carrying genuine African genetic ancestry. This isn't speculative. That ancestry traces directly to the transatlantic slave trade of the 16th through 19th centuries, a documented, dated historical process, backed by shipping records and colonial documentation, not a speculative ancient contact dreamed up from a photograph of a stone face. The timeline gap between this real history and the Olmec myth is enormous. The Olmec civilization had already risen and declined roughly 2,000 years before the first enslaved Africans ever arrived in colonial Mexico. 2,000 years separate the fictional 700 BCE contact story from the real, documented one. Genetic researchers can trace Costa Chica ancestry with real precision because it sits on a known historical timeline, backed by documented shipping routes and colonial-era records that give researchers exact centuries to work with, rather than a guess made from a single 19th century photograph. And here's where the irony lands hardest. The persistence of the Olmec Africa myth ends up overshadowing this real, traceable history rather than supporting it in any way. Costa Chica's actual African heritage receives far less popular attention than the fictional Egyptian contact story ever has. Crediting the Olmec's achievements to outside contact and crediting Afro-Mexican heritage to the wrong century entirely, both do the exact same damage. Both erase a specific, well-evidenced history in favor of a more dramatic but completely unsupported one. The specific documented version of this story, enslaved Africans arriving in Mexico across 3 real centuries, leaving a real and traceable genetic signature along a real coastline, turns out more interesting and more worth telling than the myth it keeps getting confused with. So why has a theory this thoroughly tested kept circulating for over 60 years? Van Sertima's theory was never seriously engaged by professional Mesoamericanists for roughly 2 decades after it was first published. And that silence didn't read as neutral. Left unchallenged in popular circulation for that long, academic quiet came across, to some readers, as tacit agreement rather than simple disinterest. When the rebuttal finally came in 1997, the current Anthropology paper didn't treat Van Sertima's theory as an isolated claim. It explicitly framed it as part of a broader Afrocentric pattern of claiming historical peoples, Hebrews, Romans, various Native American civilizations among them, as secretly African in origin. Part of what's kept the theory alive is simple mechanics. Visual pattern matching from a single photograph of a stone face is faster and more emotionally persuasive than sitting down and reading a genomics paper built on 364,470 individual data points. That asymmetry gives the visual claim a durability the underlying evidence never actually earned. Popular platforms tend to reward the more dramatic version of a story regardless of its evidentiary weight. And that dynamic is exactly what's kept a 1976 trade press book circulating for decades after its central claims were tested and rejected in the academic record. In some corners, the theory also gets defended as a matter of cultural pride rather than a testable historical claim, which makes it resistant to being updated by new data in a way most historical questions simply aren't. But every strand of actual evidence gathered across this entire investigation, the artifacts, the language, the craniofacial analysis, and now 3 separate genetic datasets spanning 2 continents, points in the same single direction. None of that requires diminishing anyone's history. It just requires putting each history in its correct century. The next and final piece of this puzzle isn't a study, it's a question worth sitting with. Lay every piece of this out side by side and the picture doesn't blur, it sharpens. 0 controlled excavation artifacts of African origin. across more than a century of professional Mesoamerican archaeology. One language family, Mixiozoque, with 0 documented links to any African language, anywhere. 17 colossal heads, read by the specialists who've actually studied them as individual ruler portraits, not as a record of an entire foreign population. A 25,000-year-old genetic split, a 6,000-year beringian standstill, and a 16,000-year-old colonization event, identical for every indigenous population from Alaska down to Chile. 5 founding maternal haplogroups and 2 founding paternal haplogroups, every one of them Asian, confirmed across a 52 population study built on 364,470 genetic markers, and reconfirmed again inside a fully unadmixed control group of 163 individuals. Regional Maya remains, recovered a few hundred kilometers from the Olmec heartland itself, carrying those same identical Asian origin lineages, and a real, documented, separately dated African genetic contribution to Mexico that belongs to the 16th through 19th centuries. Not to 700 BCE, not anywhere close to it. Every one of these data points comes from a dozen independent research teams working across entirely different methods, entirely different decades, entirely different disciplines. Archaeologists digging in Veracruz, linguists reconstructing Mixiozoque grammar, geneticists running SNP arrays on modern populations, and sequencing mtDNA out of ancient bone. None of them coordinated with each other, all of them landed in the same place. What's left standing after all of that isn't a mystery, it's a civilization that gets to be exactly what it always was. In 1862, José Melgar looked at one head, standing alone in a Veracruz jungle with no excavation behind him, and he guessed. Every tool developed since that day, controlled stratigraphy, comparative linguistics, craniofacial analysis, and population genomics capable of reading hundreds of thousands of genetic markers at once, has tested that guess directly against real evidence. The Olmec civilization built the Western Hemisphere's earliest known full writing system, an original calendar tradition, and a trade network moving jade and obsidian across hundreds of kilometers of Mesoamerican territory, using none of it borrowed from anyone else. The people who built all of that trace back, in an unbroken genetic line, to a population that crossed from Siberia into Beringia around 25,000 years ago, and held there, isolated, for 6,000 years before a single one of them ever set foot in the Americas. That's not a smaller story than the one Van Sertima told in 1976. It's a longer one, stretching back further into deep time, with better evidence standing behind every single chapter of it. The myth asked viewers to believe in a voyage with no boat ever found, no cargo ever recovered, and no artifact ever unearthed in over a century of digging. If the real record already answers this question this clearly, using data drawn from archaeology, linguistics, and genetics that all agree with each other independently, then it's worth asking what that says about a story that needed a myth standing in for evidence instead.